If you're listening to this show, as I walk on the day of release, which has become an unofficial sort of catchphrase to many, the start of an edition, it's mid-Easter holidays. And so last week I took my customary Easter break to spend a little family time. So this episode is therefore a holiday edition, a delve back into the archives to keep us walking together instead of there being silence on the airwaves. It's a chance to play back two interviews, really, from photographers I very much admire and feel extremely honoured to have chatted with, Joel Meyerowitz and Ed Kashi. Although we'll still feature the assignment, it's only the second week of that, and it's a doozer, as my Australian friends would say, from the photojournalist Jim Richardson. And, before I introduce my guests properly, I'd like to personally thank those who are Patreon members of our community, or extra milers, as you're known, and you'll hear more about them later on in the show today. But thank you also to arthelper.ai. If you've ever wanted to sell your photos, but haven't a clue where to start, arthelper.ai have popped up, and they're doing the hard bits for you, like writing social media posts or coming up with a strategy for sales. And you can get 30 days free with code Photowalk. Plus, we are supported by our friends at Lowa Boots, spelt L-O-W-A. And if you need new boots, then you'll be pleased to know that using the code Photowalk, all one word, on all the W's, lowa.co.uk, you can receive 25% off the price of boots and shoes up to the end of this month. You will find the links, this month being April 2025, you'll find the links for Lowa and artlist.ai on the show page. So, in this holiday special, my two guests, well, in a while, 7 Agency's Ed Kashi. But first up, a return to an interview recorded a couple of years ago now. But I've always felt it's full of photographic, thoughtful gems. So that's why I'm playing an archive re-edited version today. Since I like a good radio metaphor as well, try this one on for size. There are some photographers who don't just document the world, they tune into it. It's like they're hearing a frequency the rest of us sort of miss. Joel Meyerowitz is one of those rare voices, a pioneer of colour photography, a poet of the street. He's widely regarded as one of the most influential American photographers of the last century, although that influence certainly stretches into this one as well. He was one of the first to really champion colour photography at a time when black and white still ruled the art world. His work on the streets of New York in the 60s and 70s helps define a whole era of street photography. Sharp, spontaneous, and full of life. He's also known, though, for slower, more contemplative projects like his work in Cape Cod. And we do talk about this one, the powerful documentation of Ground Zero after 9/11. This conversation may have been recorded a couple of years ago, but what stands out is just how clear his voice has always been, not just as a photographer, but certainly as a thinker. An absolute pleasure to talk with him. Here's Joel Meyerowitz. I know it's a well-documented story, but speaking as somebody, Joel, who owes a debt of complete and unconditional gratitude to my father for his belief in inspiration and the fact that he seemed to read the world with an air of inquisition, though he wasn't a photographer. You have very much the same story. You say you learned the art of quiet observation from your father, but I wonder how.
My father was a real street guy. He grew up in Harlem, born in 1908, a real, sort of rugged, individualist, street smart guy. Got to survive, came from a big European family, although he was born in America. And he always lived on the streets. He was a salesman when I was a little kid, and I would often go with him on his rounds around New York. His modus operandi was not to go into a store and ask for an order. He would go in and hang out with guys. And he was very funny, quick to humor, quick on his feet, quick with his hands. And so he kind of just talked to people. And usually the conversations were animated and funny. And afterwards, they would just give him the order. He wouldn't have to ask for it. And I once, said to him, "Hey, Pop, you forgot to ask the guy for the order." And he said, "He knows why I'm here. My job is just to go in and have a good time and enjoy myself. And when I leave, he'll tell me what he needs." He said, "I don't have to ask." And so I watched the way he managed those work and life situations with a kind of good sense of humor and playful spirit and good cheer. And on the street, my father would talk to anybody. He'd always say hi to people, or he'd make a comment about something they wore or whatever. And on the block that we lived on in the Bronx, which was sort of, I wouldn't say a ghetto, but it was really working class down at the bottom, real blue collar. Yeah. My father was considered the mayor of the block because he was talkative that way. He was also quick with his hands because he was the first Golden Gloves champion, which was a boxing thing of 1929. Imagine that. Yeah. On the eve of the Depression, they had a boxing. They invented this boxing thing, and he won the first time. So he was sort of treated with a kind of respect on the street. And as his kid, the first of his kids, I could see the way people responded to him. And I watched him often point things out to me, like, "Keep an eye on this, Joel. Watch what's going to happen here." And things would happen. And I grew up kind of wondering how he knew. I mean, how could he predict that they would have this engagement, or a fight would break out, or something funny would happen, or somebody would slip on a banana peel, that kind of pratfall. And I think it was just a kind of alert sensibility growing up on the streets of Harlem, where he had to take care of himself from an early age, that gave him this insight. And, as a child, I received this information from him, but each of us processes the information we learn from our parents or from the world around us in our own way. He certainly wasn't trying to make me a visual artist. No. He was just teaching me or showing me human behavior in all of its glories and foolishness and humor, the rich potential of it. And for some reason, that went into whatever available space within me that could misread his guidance and make something personal out of it for myself, which I think is what all artists do. I think they misread the information that they take in through books or artworks or observation and mold it to our own necessity.
You went on a road trip with your dad and your son. A very unique bonding experience, the three of you. Must have been fascinating conversation.
Well, it was. And he was the ultimate unreliable narrator. He was in the midst of an Alzheimer's development, which is why we went on the road trip.
That was the reason, yeah.
I wanted to get him out of assisted living in Florida, which was really a horrible situation. On the surface, they all sound like they're country clubs. Yeah. But in reality, these assisted living places, at least in America, if any person is slightly lively or, out of order in their terms, because they've got good and high spirits, they narcotize them with drugs. And to see my lively father numb and dull was so outrageous to me that I decided to take him out of there, get him off the drugs, and take him on a road trip and make a movie, because I wanted to share the Alzheimer's experience with everybody, thinking his three sons, my brothers Rick and Steve, if we couldn't see what was happening to him, because my mother was kind of hiding it, then how many other families were there in America or the world where people didn't recognize what was going on, or they already started to put that person in, a kind of out, to get them out of the world and sort of put them in a corner somewhere. And I felt that I needed to see this firsthand so that we could all learn about what the possibilities and potential for Alzheimer's people was about having a life and being loved by family. And so I thought the road trip was a great outing, getting him away from routines and having his son and his grandson take care of him. And I got to tell you, I don't know if you've seen the film. It's on my website where it's easily seen. But he still had that kind of mayor of the block attitude. He would talk to anybody. He just couldn't quite remember 5 minutes later what was going on. But his generosity of spirit and his desire to connect was still robust.
Well, I think that generosity of spirit is obviously alive and working very well in you. And we'll come back to your mentoring shortly. Painting was your muse, but your own photographic epiphany came through the one and only Robert Frank, which is not a bad place for it to come from, is it?
What a jolt.
I know.
You know? I mean, if you know, we all have the responsibility of being awakened to our potential. And it doesn't always come from inside. Sometimes somebody outside puts the key in your lock and just turns it enough for you to catch a glimpse of possibility, which was all that happened. I wasn't a photographer. I wasn't interested in photography. I had no camera. I was still a painter and a graphic designer and working in a small agency. And I designed this booklet, and Robert was the hired photographer. I had no idea he was Robert Frank, you know. But he was a friend of my boss's. And so Harry, my boss, said, just go down and make sure he gets all the pictures for the booklet. I went there. He paid me no mind whatsoever, Robert. But watching him work, and really even more than watching him work, hearing the click of the Leica and seeing the action in front of him when the click happened was an epiphany. Because I was looking over his shoulder the whole time, was behind him, off to the side, but I could see these gestures appearing in front of him that either happened spontaneously or that he motivated by a few soft words. There were two young girls he was photographing. But it was as if every moment that had a peak, he made a picture of it. And I didn't understand it until I saw it repeated again and again, the high point. Because as a painter, when I had been in art school and we were doing life drawing and everything, I was always looking for the gesture on the model's part that released some recognition, even without words, but something that became visually dynamic in some way. So I probably had some carryover of that. In any event, watching him for a couple of hours really was stimulating. And when I left the shoot to go out on the street and go back to the office, suddenly the street was alive in a way it had never been before. I saw every gesture as potential for meaning. Every interaction between strangers who weren't coming together to do anything together, but were in the same space together. And it was as if the space suddenly had a knot in it, that it became visible. You know, that's what it was.
And did you know at that moment that this was it then? You say epiphany, but was this the moment where you said to yourself, well, Joel, I can't think of anything else I'd rather do with the rest of my life?
Well, I didn't think about the entirety of the future, but I knew, you know, I would have taken the bus back to the agency because it was only about 30 blocks away. Instead, I walked back to the agency, and block after block, crowd after crowd, incident after incident began piling up. And by the time I got to 53rd and 5th Avenue, where the building was, I knew that I had to quit my job, get a camera, and go out on the street. Beyond that, I knew nothing. I just had this fulfillment, this instinct of like a heat inside of me that said, don't spend any more time in an office. Be on the street. And I got back to the office and I went in to see Harry, and he said, well, how was the shoot and everything? I said, it was great, Harry. I'm quitting on Friday. and this guy looked at me and it was like, was it so bad? Are you afraid you're going to get fired? I said, no, it was a miracle. I saw things that I didn't know I needed to be part of. And so I want to go out on the street and I want to photograph street life.
You're so important to many photographers who followed your work, been inspired by your work and your ethics and your philosophy, and they've become street observers because of you and what they see. There's never been a time where you can see quite so much photography of the street, of course, has there?
I think there's an abundance of it now that has been released by smartphones and the ease of making photographs with a digital device and then seeing it on screen relatively quickly, both on the street on the back of the camera or coming back to their computer. And I think that people's appetite has increased worldwide. The photography is the universal language now. We used to think music was, and certainly it maintains that. But in the past, you used to have to buy a camera. If you wanted to take pictures, you have to buy a camera and walk around with it, have film in your pocket, be prepared to spend on the film, spend on the processing, and then do something with it. And that narrowed the field to those passionate amateurs or people who wanted to do that. And carrying a camera was a slight burden at the time, given the scope of them. But nowadays, the facility of the smartphone has bred a new kind of desire. And I think this has opened up the world to photographers being at ease in going out into the world, making pictures. I think what's still difficult for most people is learning how to recognize their own identity. I think there's a lot of mimicry that goes on because there's such an abundance of imagery on the internet. People look at it and say, oh, I want to make pictures like that. And so I think mimicry is a leveler that sort of flattened a lot of photography. But people poke up. Yeah. They get that inner line of understanding, and they rise to the occasion and begin to find their identity. And certainly that's where I feel the mentoring that I might offer is to support that kind of search for your own identity.
Legacy of one's work being so important. There's so much in the decades of your work we could talk of. We'd be here all day, Joel. And I know you've got a busy day of shooting in the beautiful part of the world that you live in, I'm sure. But a street photographer in London called Nick Turpin spoke to me about a particular photograph of yours, which we featured on the show a while back, The Fallen Man in Paris, as being pivotal to his own career. And I would imagine it's a fairly familiar story. It's a picture of drama, the sadness of humanity, the busyness of a city street, and the happenstance, which is a favourite word of mine at the moment, that I think frequents a street photographer's life. Can you describe that moment and what went through your mind as you saw it unfolding?
Well, it's written deeply in my memory because of the simple fact of what happened visually, of someone having a collapse on a sidewalk right by a metro station and a bus stop, and people just standing there doing nothing. And then at the very moment that I arrived, a workman with a hammer is coming around the edge of the metro station, and his hand is on that beautiful Art Nouveau pillar where there's usually a street lamp or something. And the guy is stepping over the fallen man with the hammer raised in his hand. He's just stepping over him like he's refuse in the street. Nobody is bending over to help this person. And, a week or two ago, there was a big story in the news about a Frenchman, a photographer, well-known photographer of flamenco artists in Paris, fell down in the street. A man my age, he's 83 years old. He was. He fell there, nicely dressed and everything. No one came to his assistance for 11 hours. He lay on the street in the cold in Paris and he died. And the very same thing might have happened to this young man, in there. But the image that I saw, even though the ballet of it was visually and photographically, physically beautiful, the disturbance that nobody went to their aid, that they were all standing there holding their packages and their briefcases and stuff, looking on. was just heart-wrenching to me, and a signal that humanity has really been dehumanized by urban life. And I can tell you that there have been times on the streets of New York City where I have been witness to someone tripping or falling or stepping off a bus and slipping, or their knee collapsing, and I've moved immediately to their aid, to pick them up, to help them to their feet, to ask if I can get something, to call other people over. And New Yorkers generally rise to the occasion with a kind of open-heartedness that is, I think, incredibly affecting to me. And yet I haven't seen that I didn't see that in Paris.
We see moments develop, and you saw this ballet of movement, as you call it. And I've asked this a few times of photographers. And I'll ask it of you, as this developed, when you made that picture, I'm wondering, I'm fascinated to know what happened next in this story, in this famous scene.
I don't know.
Interesting.
I don't know. The crowd was pretty much as you see it. They were just standing around.
Yeah.
And the guy with the hammer left. I know many times people say to me, why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you help? And my answer is, I didn't speak a word of French. I wouldn't know what to say or do for this guy. I melted back into the crowd because I felt ineffective. I felt like I wouldn't be of help.
Yeah. Do you think some photographers are luckier or more observant, that they almost magically draw or are drawn to these scenes?
I think it's an issue of discipline.
Right.
If you're not on the street, it's like the tree in the forest, you don't know it falls. If you're not on the street every day, 6-8 hours a day, doing your work, which is paying attention and being present, if you don't do that, then you don't get the images. You have to have that passion that drives you to your limits so that you're out there. That's all there is to it. If you're not out, you won't see the pictures that happen. You'll have missed them all. Yeah. I was lucky because I had Tony at first.
Tony Ray Jones, yeah.
Then I had Gary Winogrand.
Yes.
A few months later, we bumped into each other. And Gary was 10 years older than me, but he was a Bronx guy like I was. And we had caught sight of each other on the street, although we hadn't spoken. But one day we met on the train, on the subway, coming back from the Bronx. We both had gone up to see our mothers. And we were on the same train coming back, and we recognized each other. And, two Bronx Jewish guys, street guys, we started talking, and he said, I'll call you tomorrow morning. We'll go for a walk early. I'll meet you for breakfast at the Greasy Spoon. And that became our habit for the next, I left in the middle of 66, I went away to Europe for a year. So Gary and I worked steadily almost every single day from late 1962 to mid 1966. So that's like 4 years. Yeah. We saw each other every day. And the evenings, my wife and I would go to his place and help him make dinners for his kids 3 nights a week because he was getting divorced. And he couldn't quite handle the kids. So we really we had a life together. And Gary came to Europe to see me in Europe, and we spent some time together. We caught up in America on different trips together. We had a good, I would say, until 68 or 9, when Gary started to move away from New York. We had an incredibly tight friendship. And it was interesting because with a 10-year difference, with me being a brand new baby on the street and Gary being an old hand, it didn't seem to matter. We had a conversational connection and affiliation, a sensibility about New York and being New Yorkers that closed that gap. And it was just friendship. It didn't seem to me or to him either that there were these levels. We were in it together.
I think it was Gary that said it's important sometimes to come back with nothing as it is to come back with everything.
Yeah, there are days when you shoot 6 rolls of film, 8 rolls of film in the course of a day. That's a lot, and you're trying to change your tempo, or you're looking, something's been niggling at you for days that you wanted to pay attention to, but nothing's happening, in that area. It happens at times. And then you look at the contact sheets and you think, oh, I wasn't so asleep after all. I got this. And this becomes the key that opens the next portal to whatever might be a subject that revealed itself by chance, a risk you took by making a leap at something that wasn't well formed yet, just like you're not well formed in the moment, but it indicates a kind of shift. And I think that's part of the gift and the risk of street photography. You don't always get what you want, but you often get something that you didn't know you wanted. And you understand from that point on, this is gritty enough that I can get some traction with it. It's not going to slip away. I'll get this visual traction and begin to push on this a little bit more. So street photography is about not only that discipline of being out there, but of recognizing moments of visualization, of the unexpected, that tell you something that's bigger than yourself, that's out of reach, but you can get a grip and pull yourself up to it. There's something going on in Gary's late work. I mean, there was a book done at his, after his death by Leo Rubinstein, which he put together. He edited a lot of Gary's unedited pictures, the garbage cans full of stuff. But one of the issues that was difficult for me is that I felt that Leo, or that generation, was looking into those pictures for Gary of the past. They wanted Gary from the 60s. That's not what was happening. Gary was in the 80s and he was dying. He was ill and he was living in California where people aren't on the street, where you drive everywhere instead of walking. Yeah. And because he was ill, he was driving a lot and he was shooting things far away. The work is there in the far away stuff. Gary, and I can tell you this because it's true, Gary saw my 8x10 work and bought an 8x10 camera, not the personality to use it because it was probably too slow. Yeah. But he bought that 8x10 camera. And one of the things the 8x10 does, it resolves things far away fantastically, because a sheet of 8x10 film is 36 exposures of 35 millimeter. So the lower right-hand corner of a big picture is a 35 millimeter slide. So a whole sheet of 8x10 is an incredibly rich thing. You can blow up that 8x10 and that little 35 millimeter corner is going to hold exquisite resolution. I think Gary was beginning his own dialogue. And had he lived longer, perhaps, we don't know, but perhaps Gary would have used a large format camera to resolve some of these issues he was discovering in the spaciousness of Los Angeles, which is anything but the crowdedness of New York. I think there was a missed opportunity, and a friend of mine who was a good friend of Gary's, Tom Roma, photographer, he and I have talked about this a few times and have thought maybe we should go in and re-edit that work, looking at Gary as he was then, not as he might have been 20 years before.
In terms of discovery, Wildflowers, I suppose, is a perfect example of that, where you looked into your work and thought, hold on, there's something going on here that I didn't realize was happening.
Yes, well, photographers are really collectors of moments.
Yeah.
Like some people collect antiques or junk-tiques or, first edition books or whatever. I mean, people collect. Photographers are collecting sensations that happen so instantaneously that they're gone almost as soon as they appear. And the camera is the perfect instrument for snatching a thousandth of a second out of reality and holding on to it. So we collect all kinds of moments. But how do you sort them? We're lucky today with keywording and Lightroom or databases or things like that, because you can put in something. You can type in Cadillac, which I did this morning for something. I typed in Cadillac, and up came like 65 photographs of Cadillacs. Who the hell knew that I had that many Cadillac pictures? But, they appear in pictures, either on purpose or marginally. And when I keyword, I note, it's a Cadillac. But when you look at 65 pictures of Cadillacs, suddenly there's a body of work. Interesting enough to consider, maybe I've got something to go with here. And that's what happened with Wildflowers. It happened on an editing table, Lightbox, where I was going through a shoot that I had done commercially, because in those days, that was the only way to survive and support yourself. Everybody did it. Robert Frank shot commercial, that's how I met him. Gary shot liquor ads and airplane ads, and Lee Friedlander shot record covers, and Diane Arbus shot, fashion. Bill Klein, shooting fashion. Anyway, I was editing this take, and there were a couple of pictures that didn't belong in that take that I made while I was doing the job that were sort of offsides. And I sort of took them out of the pile, but put them together because they had in them some kind of flower thing. Yeah. Not pretty flowers, but a funny flower thing. Anyway, I had a handful of them up there. And then I thought, I know I've got other pictures with flowers. So I started going through my slides, just looking. And sure enough, after a couple of days, I had hundreds of pictures. And I thought, I have been photographing funny flower incidents without even knowing it.
I know.
And it's that kind of a wake up that is so delicious in the world of photography, because we're making pictures in a fraction of a second. If we were artists, painters, working on a painting for weeks, trying to resolve something, your output is less, and you actually stay in connection to what you're doing throughout the process. But photography, you're constantly flipping the page in a sense. You're just pressing the button and keep on going. So in order to recover those things, you need a clue, And frankly, I'll make an aside here. At this point in my life, I'll be 84 in 10 days. I have the time being here to review all that work that never got out there. Because in the 60s and 70s, no one gave a shit about photography. It was a craft. It wasn't really a legitimized art form. They were just beginning to take it seriously. You couldn't even make a living, really, selling your work. There was no chance for a lot of that youthful work to go out into the world. So now at the other end of the arc, I have the time on my hands to go back and look at this work. We just scanned 140,000 Kodachromes in the studio, and now we're scanning 70,000 black and white negatives, many of which have never seen the light of day. So I have an opportunity to reconsider, from the vantage point of age, the effervescence of youth, the volatility, the variety, the challenges, the intuition that brought me to make certain kinds of pictures and do it repeatedly, but which never got a chance to see daylight. So in a way, I have a chance now to rediscover who I was as a young artist from the point of view of the older man now.
I'm thinking that the title of this book, you heard it here first, could be Daylight, couldn't it? These pictures seeing daylight for the first time.
Seeing daylight.
Yeah, there we go.
Lovely, witty title.
Yeah.
Really, thank you.
Write that one down.
Thank you. You're not kidding. I'm writing it down.
He's actually writing it. Now. Seeing Daylight. Well, if that's the next book, I will be immeasurably proud to have been just a small slither of it. You said the words, though, not me.
Well, but you recognized the moment title for
there we go.
The word.
I'm letting you write it. I'm not interrupting.
Okay, there you go. It's written.
It's written. It's written.
It's written. No, it's a beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, because they've been hidden away in the dark. It's perfect.
Amazing. I want to change the tone quite dramatically, actually. I would imagine many people think of 9/11 and the documentation of it as a story, as well, comprehensively and meticulously studied through the lenses of so many photographers and so many important photographers. And indeed, on the day of this seismic world event, it was. What isn't perhaps so known is that following that dreadful day, it became harder to photograph and document Ground Zero because it was declared this crime scene by Rudy Giuliani. But you gained access and built a historically vital archive. And I wonder how.
New York smarts. No, really, it's a kind of chutzpah. You know the expression chutzpah?
Mm.
It's a Yiddish expression. New Yorkers use it all the time. It's like having balls. You know, you want to do something, you got to have the balls to do it. You got to figure it out. You can't just say, oh, I want to do this, and you expect someone to come with a magic wand and tap you on the head. Okay, now you can do it. I had to figure out how I can get in there. A cop told me, no photographs, buddy, this is a crime scene. And when I heard that, and I argued with her, and I said, what about the press? And she pointed and said, there's the press. They're not going in either. I thought, if the press is not going in, there's not going to be a record. How could Giuliani, do that to the people of New York? And so I decided that's my job. I'm going to do that. I'm going to figure out how to get in there.
Yeah.
And so I worked, the streets. I started to think who I knew, what could I do, blah, blah. And finally I remembered, Adrian Benepe. He was the commissioner of Manhattan's parks, and his father was a good friend of mine, and his father had founded the green market system of New York. All the outdoor markets of New York were conceived of by his dad, who really made a great and effective offering to the people of New York. You know, just like I go to the green markets in London when I'm there. And so I called Adrian, who I knew since he was a little kid. He said, you're a straight arrow. I know you. I'll get you a Parks Department badge tomorrow. You go in, but we have nothing to do with you after you go in. You're on your own. So sure enough, he gave me the little badge, and I immediately scanned it and printed it out in all the colors because they were New York City and all of its stupidity. It printed the badges on construction paper that kids use in school, pink, blue, red, green, yellow, magenta. Yeah. They printed it on the cheapest paper you could find, available anywhere. I bought one. I bought a pack of paper, and I made my own badges. I went down there. This Smokey, a ranger, drove me in a little 3-wheeled vehicle. He dumped me in the middle of Ground Zero and said, good luck, bye. And there I was standing there with my view camera on my shoulder, my 35 millimeter, bag of, holders for the film, rolls of film in my pocket. And I look around and I see everybody's wearing boots, hard hats, masks, gloves. And I thought, oh shit, I better get a hard hat. And I see on a plywood wall that had been erected, I see a hard hat hanging. Nobody around. I go over, I pick up the hard hat.
Don't tell me you lifted it.
I lifted it and put it on my head.
Right.
And the thing about it was so great. On the front, it said NYPD.
Oh.
And on the back was an American flag. And I thought, got my first bit of equipment. Then I went over and I got myself a respirator and a pair of gloves. And there was a place where they were giving out boots, and I put on boots, and then I got, a reflecting vest. And within a few minutes, I looked like everybody else.
And then you spent 9 months there, didn't you? Best part of 9 months, I think. Thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs. I wonder whether you would. I mean, your work is. There's so many important facets to your work, and the books and the pictures and the street work. But I wonder whether you might describe this as perhaps your most important work.
Yeah, I think in historical terms, it was one of those necessities that was being obliterated by Giuliani's resistance. And it required someone to go in and give up their life for whatever it took.
Yeah.
9 months in this case. And to do it with a kind of discipline, get up. I was in 12 hours a day, sometimes 14 hours a day. I'd get up 7 o'clock in the morning. I'd be down there. By midnight, I would sometimes be, because they worked 24 hours a day.
Yes, they did, yeah.
There were 3 shifts that came in, so it was working round the clock.
It was.
And so I could be there through 2 shifts, sometimes into 3 shifts. My wife was willing to give me that kind of room to go and do that and not be available on a regular basis. And I just knew it was important, and there was no money to be made from it. I couldn't sell the pictures or publish them. During it, Juliana had basically put a ban on it. I just built the archive, hoping that someday it would have resonance and value and be useful for historians. And that there'd be a museum to hold it and all of that. So it was a total gamble, and it cost me a lot of money to do it. I didn't work basically for 9 months. I didn't have a job. I'm not a rich guy. I had a studio. I put more people on in the studio. I had 7 people working for me in the studio so that they could process the work and put it into the database and make the files and, keep the organization of it going. I had to mortgage my house. I had to take a business loan. I did get some money at some point from a charity, from a foundation, but I couldn't take the money personally because I wasn't a legitimate recipient of these funds. I had to pass the funds through the Museum of the City of New York, and I never received that money. I mean, this was one of these outrageous interactions that just, you can't believe that it happened.
Well, there's a story I've not read about that and your association with it at all. Life is apparently less frantic than the gift New York provides, but no less photographic. You live in a part of the world with your wife that's become very precious now. Why the beautiful hills and the scenery of Tuscany? I shouldn't need to ask, probably, because it's beautiful. I visited myself. I could see myself living there in that part of the world. But what became your choice?
My wife, Maggie Barrett, was my second wife. I'm her 5th husband.
The most perfect one, I'm sure.
Well, it's lasted longest. It's lasted 30. We're together 31 years.
Well, there we go. That's perfection.
Anyway, after we met, a few years after we met, we taught a workshop in Tuscany.
Right.
I taught a photography workshop, and she came along after she got her MFA in writing. And in this workshop, we saw that it was poorly run and that people weren't getting their money's worth because of the way it was formed. And we both understood right away, this place, it's only 1 kilometer from where we live now. And it was so beautiful that we thought we could run this workshop ourselves and make a better workshop. And we decided to run a writing and a photography workshop.
Perfect.
In the same location. And we asked the man who's now our best friend here, one of the reasons we live here, we asked Johnny, we'd like to teach a workshop. Do you have a space next year? And he said, take June. So we took June, and June was fantastic. And then we took June for 7 summers until 9/11. And that summer, we had a full workshop. But because I was working in Ground Zero during the lead up to the workshop for 2002, I decided that we couldn't do the photography workshop because I didn't know if I was going to still be inside Ground Zero. Yeah. Because the Ground Zero ended on May 31st, and the workshop would have started 2 or 3 days later. So we canceled it, and we never picked it up again. But we kept on coming back here because this place had an impact on our lives, and because we were given a book to do called Inside the Light. It's a book on Tuscany. And we got so deeply involved in the culture here. It's not about the surface. It's the way life is lived in Italy that meant something to us and that we began to perceive. And so we just wanted more of that. And the time came a few years ago to take a risk. Maggie said, let's go to live in Europe for a year and see what happens. You've always wanted to go back after the year you spent with your first wife traveling in Europe in 66 and 67. Now you're with someone you love and who loves you. Why don't you spend a year doing this? And so a year has become 8 years now.
It's a beautiful part of the world to live. Is it true that you trawl the flea markets of the region looking for trinkets of life to observe and photograph?
That part started in France. We had done a book on France too. After the Tuscany book. In 2011 and 12, we did a book on Provence. And at that point, something came up for me about the still life. Part of my evolution in photography is seeing that there's more than one thing. Yeah. Photography has a vocabulary historically that's covered everything: architecture, landscape, portraits, interiors, still lifes, streets, balloon, aerial photographs. I mean, people have figured out ways to photograph. And I had never made still lifes in the same way I had never really made portraits. But suddenly it appealed to me because it raised the question. And I started, after photographing Morandi's objects and Cézanne's object, because that's where I discovered my feeling for the object, I decided to see what objects interested me. I've never collected anything. I had too many photographs. I didn't want to collect things, I wasn't a curiosity seeker. But suddenly, I know you can't show this to your listeners, but suddenly stuff looked interesting to me,
Yeah, I can see it.
I mean, what the hell is this thing?
That looks like, is it a cigar box or
it looks to me like it might have held cigarettes or something. But look how complex it is.
It is.
And it has dimensions, and it looks interesting. So I began to see that funny things. It's for holding stamps.
Oh, is it? For holding stamps? Right.
It's got little shells for stamps or whatever else you want to put in it. But these things are objects. I don't know what this is. It's like a hot water bottle or something.
Made out of brass by the looks of it.
Yeah. So I started to ask myself, what is it that I like?
Yeah.
I didn't know what I liked. But by going around French flea markets, I began to think, oh, that's interesting to me. Why do I like that thing that screws into a wall or something? Why do I like this folding? And so I started to pull objects that had lived once and then were sort of discarded. And they turn up in a thrift store or in a junk pile or in a flea market. Yeah. And they have a strange appeal. Everybody is capable of discovering aspects of their sensibility. Let's call it their sensibility, because that's all photography is. It's a sensibility that you feel about where you are or things you see, and you react within your sensibility by saying, ooh, and you raise the camera and you make a photograph of the thing that called out to your sensibility. And by doing this again and again, you define yourself, or you identify who you are to yourself. And that's the story of photography. These pictures are all about you, yourself. They look like the world. The world is just the place that the pictures live in and are invisible in until you recognize them. Most people think photography is a whole different idea, but really, if you're curious about who you are and your own identity, you're going to figure out, how do I express that? And to me, that is the secret of photography that's in plain sight for everyone. But not everybody understands it that way. They think it's an object that you've got to copy with a camera. They turn the moment into a concrete object of something. They identify it and they put it in the middle of the frame. That's, I think, one of the great drawbacks of contemporary image making today, using the smartphone and the digital camera, is people use the bullseye approach. Ooh, I got it. It's in the middle. I got it. But let's face that. That's dumb show. That's like trying to shoot the arrow into the target. The frame itself is what needs to be filled, not the middle. Frame is a dynamic proportion, which is the classic ideal 2:3. It's the golden mean, as Cartier-Bresson would say. And so you have a geometric proportion that is exquisitely poised to hold information. You just have to make it interesting when you put it in the frame. That's your responsibility. Make it interesting.
The godfather of modern colour photography, Joel. It's a title attributed to you in books, online, in interviews. You've observed the world and you now teach and mentor. You're now pointing out life, as you have just a moment ago. Its flaws and the mystery and the wonder, doing for others what your father did for you, which we have kind of come full circle on our conversation, really, and it must make you immeasurably proud.
Well, it does. Actually, I haven't thought of it like that, but when you put it in those terms, all of us want to be successful at what we do. And success is too often measured by financial success. But the success within yourself of doing something that gives you pleasure and educates you, to me, that is the goal, is to understand something about yourself in the world you live in through a medium that you are connected to, through some passion, through some big effort to understand it. And if along the way you begin to have glimpses of yourself reflected by the medium, and you're in a position to share them with other people, that's a measure of success that is only on the personal and interpersonal level. It's about the energy that you've absorbed from the world and you transmit back out, because we are all transmitters. You, Neo, by doing what you're doing, conveying our conversation to people who want to hear it from you, are a transmitter, and you're doing this from your own passion, your own curiosity, and you do it eloquently. I have to say your questions, the organization of your thoughts, the arc of our conversation has been carefully crafted by you so that we arrive here where we began in some way, in a very easy, relaxed manner. We've actually had a real conversation about things, that interest both of us and hopefully your listeners.
A real honour to talk with Joel Meyerowitz. And, I've had contact with him since a few times, actually. In fact, he set one of the micro assignments for the London Encounters adventure, 2 days at the end of this month. Making pictures, finding encounters with people, street pictures, some micro assignments, a history trail on both days. And there's still actually one place available on this. And because I know, as I said the other week, I know sometimes some people think, I don't know, will I be available that day? And it's sort of left till nearer the time. And then they think, yeah, do you know what? Yes, I'm available. And stop press-ish. The documentary photographer, my good friend Giles Penfound, with all those years in charge of the British Army's photography, he's agreed to come and do a workshop stroke mentoring session on the first morning to help you understand how to storytell with your camera, because storytelling is what this Encounters workshop is all about. So if you are interested and you'd like to come along, then go to the website, photowalk.show. Look for the Encounters tab at the top, and that has all the details of how you can join us in London on the 24th and 25th of April, at the end of this month, Thursday and Friday. Before we return to this week's show, my thanks to those who keep us walking each week, such as our patrons, you know who you are, and now arthelper.ai for the next few months. If you've ever thought about selling your photography online but haven't a clue where to start, I think Art Helper could probably help you, because it's made for people like us. Here's how it works. You upload a photo, magically and instantly, professional content is made for you, such as social media posts, email newsletters, even full Substack articles, all in your own voice. It can also generate hundreds of mock-ups for every image you upload, things like your work framed, so people get a real understanding of what your photograph could look like on their wall. It helps you connect with the right buyers and even suggests pricing based on your market. And unlike most AI tools, it has an art protection guarantee, which means something very important: your images are never used for AI training. Free to try, and Art Helper is giving our listeners a special deal. Go to arthelper.ai, use the code PHOTOWALK and get 30 days free of the pro version. I'll have a link on the show page. It's a great way to start selling your art or growing the business you already have. And thank you, arthelper.ai, for your belief in this show.
Through everything, here we stand. Hand in hand, I'm yours.
Next week, all being well, there's the India special. It's a chance to join 9 photographers, myself, Jason, and also our lead guide, Shivam, atop the 9 as we adventure in Delhi and Jodhpur. Right, my second from the archives guest in a moment, Ed Kashi from the 7 Agency. First up, a new assignment has been launched for April, and here it is, set by former guest, the photojournalist and traveller with a camera himself, Jim Richardson.
The Photowalk assignment.
A one-word assignment. What word would you choose?
Context.
And why context? Give me some context for the context.
Context is all the things you put within the frame of a photograph that contribute to make it into a storytelling picture.
Right.
It's how we know and how we interpret photographs when we look at them. And it's hard to do, but it's such a valuable skill to think of about how you do it and why it contributes to making pictures better.
Can you give me an example of a picture you've taken that shows this context?
Sure. Go find when I went out to the Isle of Muck and I was photographing Lawrence McEwen up on top of his island, Muck, and within the photograph you have Lawrence, and Lawrence is a great portrait. I mean, he's got these eagle eyes and this hair blowing, and he's just a great character.
Wonderful.
But with it is his sheepdog is over on one side of the frame, and the island is stretching out into the sea, and the bay is over on the right side of the frame, and the Isle of Egg is in the background, and all of that. So it's not just like, a tight portrait of Lawrence, which would have been good too, but it's Lawrence in context. It's Lawrence in his environment. He's in his world, and this is what his world looks like, and it enriches what we know about him because there is context.
So best of luck. Send your pictures to stories@photowalk.show. Stories@photowalk.show. If you can, resize your picture to 2,500 pixels wide, please. Otherwise, don't worry. Send it full resolution, and I will join together now. I will do the heavy lifting. Send me some thoughts about the picture too, if it helps you tell your story. Some of the narratives we've had to accompany the pictures have been absolutely incredible. They truly have. No watermarks, no borders, but do include any social feeds or links to your website, Flickr, Glass, Photo with an F, or whatever. And show us where we can enjoy more of your work, and I'll be sure to link. The pictures and stories will go onto the assignments page, and you'll find that on photowalk.show. And some may also well feature on our Photowalk Instagram, which helps get more eyes on your work and helps our community to grow. I'll be sure to clearly tag straight back to you. But good luck with this assignment. Right, time for our second from the archives guest. Ed Kashi is a photojournalist, a filmmaker, an educator who spent decades covering some of the most complex human stories from around the world, from geopolitical conflict to social justice, aging, the environment. His work isn't just about, obviously, these superb, strong images that he makes. It's about advocacy, and we talk often about advocacy with our guests. Ed's storytelling goes beyond still photography because he often combines visuals with video and sound to deepen the impact. He's a founding member of 7 Photo Agency. This interview was recorded a couple of years back, but as with Joel, I think it's still full of insight on what it means to be a visual storyteller with purpose, and that doesn't date at all. Here's my second archives guest. This is Ed Kashi. Ed, I'm trying to steer clear of the usual tell me how it all started question in terms of who gave you your first camera and all that kind of stuff. But I did hear you talk about the why of this thing called photography, your sort of incurable curiosity. I thought perhaps that's how it started, more than the technical side. Perhaps that's what brought you to photography, maybe.
Well, what brought me to photography was storytelling. And this was before I was old enough to articulate this or understand it. But basically, by the time I was about 15 or 16, I fell in love with literature. And I lament that I cannot remember the name of the English teacher I had in whatever 9th or 10th or 11th grade, whatever it was, who really turned me on to literature. And I just became enthralled with reading novels and then talking about it and analyzing it. And so then by the time I prepared to go to university, I was imagining I'd become a writer. And as I say, my freshman year college poetry professor absolved me of any thought that I could be a writer. He was actually quite brutal. Oh. And so, I'm just like an 18-year-old kid, like, oh, damn, what am I going to do now? And thankfully, I went to a university, Syracuse University in upstate New York, that has one of the best photojournalism programs in the world. And so for some reason, I pivoted and said, maybe I'll do photography. And it's so curious to look back and imagine like how that all happened then. But anyway, and then within 2 or 3 months of learning basic black and white darkroom photography, I was enthralled. It was like, I was addicted, I could imagine my life forever doing this and it never getting boring or repetitive or, and then what it tapped into were a few things. It was like synthesized my natural curiosity, my desire to sort of be a learner, which I, to this day, to the day I die, I will want to learn and try to understand things. But it was able to mix it with my social and political heart. Because I grew up in New York in the 60s and 70s, where like the breast milk of that time was anti-Vietnam War protests and women's rights, civil rights movement, all of these things, environmental rights, Earth Day. All this was like this blossoming of progressive thought. And so that was deep in me, and also this desire to help people, to be engaged with people. So photography, thankfully for me, became this sort of, it synthesized all these different strands that were within me at a time where I had no clue because I wasn't self-aware enough. But anyway, that's really kind of where it all began.
Well, literature's loss is definitely photography's gain. I would imagine with the people that you mentor now and you teach, that must fly. Well, what happened to you with being forced out of literature, if you like, that must fly in the face of what you tell your students these days. Don't ever let anybody tell you can't do something creative.
That's right. Well, and also that if you really want to do this, be in this profession, you need to be tough. You need to be prepared for a lot of disappointment and rejection. Yeah. So you better love it. Like you really need to love it. Well, and the other thing that happened which was also, I think is interesting, and I like to talk about it, especially when I lecture to either high school or college kids, is that once I got out of college and then I moved to San Francisco, and then I basically unwittingly became like a Silicon Valley photographer because that's where I was based. So this is in the early 80s. So I photographed Steve Jobs 8 or 9 times, Bill Gates, all of these people who now I wish again, then I knew what I knew now. Because I thought Steve Jobs was like a bit of a jerk and a pain in the ass. But if I knew what he was going to become, I think I would have behaved differently. But anyway, after about 4 or 5 years of this, doing all this kind of Silicon Valley coverage for the major magazines, I woke up one day and realized this is not why I wanted to be a photographer. And so I made this pivot, and that pivot brought me to the UK. It brought me to Belfast in Northern Ireland in 1988. And that is where I began my first very serious, worthy, I believe, personal project looking at the Protestant community in Northern Ireland, which back then was a very underreported part of that story. It's a very important message to young people is like, be careful, when you get out of college or whatever, when you start to get work, whatever you do, it's intoxicating, but it might not be what you actually want to do. So keep your eye on the ball of what it is you want to do.
And that Northern Ireland project, you say there was a personal project then, was there? There wasn't a commissioned project?
Yeah, no, that was a personal project.
Wow.
Most of my large projects over my career are ones that I initiated.
Yeah, what a project though, because I've recently spoken with the director of a program about the Troubles and the photographers in the Troubles, many of whom, of course, as you will know because you will have met them as you went into Northern Ireland. A lot of the photographers had been local photographers doing the check presentations and the pictures at the schools and all the things that they do, who suddenly found themselves essentially in a civil war situation.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right. Yeah, and Northern Ireland became, in some ways, like the proving ground for a lot of young photojournalists, which I'm not necessarily saying was a good thing. It is what it is, but it was a place similar to like Israel and Palestine. Those two places seem to be. I don't know why. Well, I do know why, because it's fascinating. The issue is fascinating, and but anyway, yeah. And then it became like the place where I, in a sense, found my voice, and I fell in love with Ireland and the Irish, and it was, it was sort of a harbinger of how I would work.
I think one thing that it looks to me like you did in that particular project was that you really learned how to gain trust, because the photographs that you had, often they were quite personal photographs in people's homes. They weren't always easy photographs, not easy to look at either. And that takes a great deal of trust in a photographer, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it's funny, these young Northern Irish, Protestant kids, who I hung out with. I just hung out with them for weeks and months at a time. And they nicknamed me Gaddafi.
Right.
Which is ironic. They don't realize the irony of that.
No.
Because at that exact time, Gaddafi was supplying the IRA with weapons.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you comment that you're never happier than when you have something to record in your hand. And that doesn't have to be a stills camera, does it? I think I'm fascinated by the fact that you've started putting, or not just started, but you put video into, I think the Syrian project's one in particular. You put video amongst your stills. I wonder what the thought process is, because also you love audio as well, don't you?
Yeah. Well, so for me, it was 20 years ago, actually, in 2000, that I had and it was in the middle of the Aging in America project. And I had this revelation that, which seems so sort of simplistic now, but wouldn't it be cool to do interviews with the people I'm making these like black and white Leica photographs with, right? And so that's where it began. It was a really simple, humble idea that I wanted to start to capture the voices of my subjects. And it grew from there. And now I would say that I predominantly work as a filmmaker at this stage, partly out of not necessity, partly because that's where a lot of opportunities are, but also because the power of it. And as you say, like audio is such a revelation. You'll appreciate this. So once I started to do video, and audio, then there were times where I'd be out in the field working as a still photographer, and I had now developed like a new sense.
Yes.
And I'd be listening to what was going on and what was being said, and I'd realize I'll never be able to make a photograph that will capture what is going on here, because what is going on here is not visually interesting, but if you could hear what was going on, it would be fascinating. Yeah. And so filmmaking allows me to sort of, again, synthesize motion, images, audio, ambient sound, all the things that go in to making films. And it's in some ways a much richer experience, but it's also much more challenging in a way. I've always said it's really hard to make a great still photograph. It's easy-ish to make a good one, but to make a great film, you have to master like at least three different strands of the process.
Absolutely. I talked about this recently with a photojournalist in LA about Don McCullin lamenting that his photographs didn't stop the suffering, didn't stop the war, didn't stop bigotry, and so on and so on. But from the dark places you visited and the things that you photographed, you have very much the opposite opinion, don't you?
Well, I guess not to be too sanguine, but I do think that, there is something to be said about, illuminating other people's minds, teaching them things, showing them things. I also think, Don, who is amazing and just such an amazing photographer and just a powerhouse, but I think he came, it might also have to do with the time that he came about and the time he did his major work, where in a sense, what he was doing, that was it.
Yeah.
You were Jay-Z, you were Beyonce, you were whatever, that was it. Yes, TV was emerging, but those men and women who went out in the world with still cameras were really bringing us the most visceral, up to the moment reporting and imagery. Whereas now, as everyone knows, we're deluged daily with a tsunami of images and information. And so how do you decipher it all? How does it have an impact? But what I do believe is that, what I do now is what I call more advocacy journalism, or solutions journalism, not to put too fine a point or sequester it or ghettoize it, but it's really more about, I see an issue, I want to shine a light on the problem, but I'm hoping I can also illuminate some mechanism of a solution, or someone, or an organization, or an NGO, or a government that is addressing that problem. So you don't leave the viewer feeling hopeless.
The project that brings all this, you're talking about all these projects that you've photographed. There's one project that seems to bring it all together, and that's eye contact, which I thought was fascinating, and doubly so because I hear so many photographers talk about eye contact as being the nemesis of photojournalism or journalists, but you embraced it, and far from throwing out the pictures where people stared straight at you, you kept them and you embraced them, and you made this documentary piece out of them.
Well, it took me a while to be converted to understand that. And just to be clear, I still, my aim when I'm doing candid documentary work is to not have camera awareness by the subjects, which is, i.e., looking in the camera. But what I came to understand in doing that sort of thought piece, if you like, was that there's sometimes more power in an image when someone is looking into the camera. And that also I was trying to, in some ways I was sort of like taking a note from Bertolt Brecht with this idea of breaking the fourth wall that he talked about in theater, where sometimes, just there's a conceit that, like, how can a 6'1" guy be in a small room and not be noticed? I mean, obviously, people who I'm photographing are aware of me 90% of the time. So instead of trying to act like I was there, as the fly on the wall thing, I thought, well, let's try to embrace that and see, what does that look like? What does that feel like?
How do you make candid pictures then? You're a 6'1" guy. You've got a camera. You're obviously there as a photographer. A lot of people seem to think it's this almost, I don't know, this kind of you have to be some sort of ninja, sort of hiding, jumping out from a bush or behind a wall or something. But is it more about how you act? It has to be, because it's clear that you're there and you have this job to do.
It's a feeling. I think I've really come to understand that it's, and you could apply this to just any sort of human relations, but it's a way you make people feel. It's the way you feel. It's the way you move. Do I need to become big? Do I need to become small in a corner? Should I not say anything? It's all of those things, trying. So it's really about reading the room. And hopefully having done your homework to understand, especially when I'm working outside of the United States, understanding the cultural mores and all of those things, the religious practices, all of those things, so that, you don't put your foot in it and you behave in a way that calms people and makes them feel comfortable. And then ultimately they then they forget about you. And sometimes that can happen in 5 minutes. And sometimes it takes days or weeks to accomplish that.
But as you travel, as you make your stories, as you investigate and you learn and you study people and you mature as a photographer and being in difficult circumstances as a person as much as a photographer, how do you now feel about the world around you, Ed? Can you separate the two when there's an eyepiece between you, or are you finding that eyepiece is gradually disappearing?
Yeah, that's such an important question. So I will tell you that I feel that and people can't see me, but bringing a camera up to your face is almost like holding a gun for some people now. And in many places, it's a very provocative act. I find it more difficult in some ways to work out in public. And also because of the internet and the ability for people, or the concerns, the right concerns people have about where will their images appear and how will they be used. We need to be much more responsible now. We need to explain ourselves and assure people that we will not do anything to take advantage of their situation. Now, we don't always have the opportunity to explain that. So again, it comes back to what I previously said. It's how you move through the world. It's how you talk to people. It's just how you present yourself so that people trust you. But I know for sure, like I'm now going tomorrow down to Washington, D.C. to cover this absolutely bizarre inaugural that's about to take place. Yes. And I can tell you that this is going to be, I think, my 4th inaugural in my life that I've covered. This is going to be the first one where I'm bringing a helmet and goggles. I'm not going to bring a flak jacket because if it gets that bad, I'm going to retreat. But, I'm going to be hyper aware of everyone around me.
Of course.
And I've never, ever felt that way in the United States.
Do you blame anybody or anything for this change of attitude towards photographers domestically? I mean, we're talking about it in our own backyard. We're making these decisions now.
Yeah, I put the blame squarely on not just Trump, but other leaders in the world today who are using this line of, fake news and the media is the enemy of the people. And, it's not only, it makes me angry, but it's incredibly upsetting because and I hate to put it this way, but there's such an ignorance in anyone who believes that. It's an ignorance that hurts us all because for all the imperfections and the mistakes that people in the media make, what I know, and I'm sure you know this to be true, we're all doing our damnedest to do the best job we can. And what I also know, having experienced societies and nations that don't have free press and don't have a civil society, in some ways it's in direct correlation to each other. And so it's so hard now to explain this to people who have become brainwashed. But that's one conversation. The other one is, don't effing hit me or attack me. Like, leave me alone.
Well, that's becoming a harder message for many people to understand and respect.
Absolutely, because some of these people are fanatics. Yeah. They've become fanatical.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because these are possibly decent people, that have just been brainwashed.
Rising to the call has been your answer to the pandemic photographically. How did you set out to show another extraordinary period of our lives?
Well, last March when I had come back from a trip in Nicaragua working, actually as a piece that was published in The Guardian, I realized, this is it. We're shut down. Like all my projects that I had scheduled for this glorious year of 2020 were killed. And then, it's me and my wife are at home. What are we going to do? Well, I have to remain engaged. As I said earlier, that's why I do this. I need to be engaged with the world. So I was like, well, what can I do if I can't? Well, not that I couldn't travel, but if it's, let's say, not wise to be traveling. And especially at that point, last March, April, it felt like the world was closing in and we didn't know as much as we know now. Anyway, so I thought, well, you know what? This is a moment to work hyper locally.
Yeah.
Right. This is a moment to look at what is around me, because that I can do. I can get in my car and I can drive places. So I came up with this thought, well, why don't I look at the state of New Jersey where I live? And why don't I look at all these amazing people, individuals, companies, governmental institutions that are rising to the call. Because, and this is a very unusual, very like only positive story for me to work on, but I thought, what a great time to do this. And the other thing about it, Neil, is that it was also, it made, like, I can't tell you, like I left almost every one of those shoots, like inspired. And if I was crying, it was cry of joy that, wow, this amazing individual has decided to like pivot their company or the EMS workers who are volunteer EMS workers in the town next to mine, who, first of all, how cool to volunteer as an EMS worker in the best of times, but to do it when you could die from a virus. And you look at these people and you go, you know what, we're going to be all right. We're going to be okay, because there are way more people who are doing good than people who are behaving, I'm sorry, like idiots. And sorry, it's just it's hard not to feel angry about this sort of unnatural division that has been created by these terrible leaders, that have gained power by dividing us instead of bringing us together. But anyway, so the Rising of the Call project was really a chance to not only be inspired, but to inspire others to send a message out that there's a lot of good that's happening under this veil of sort of darkness and tragedy.
I want to bring that back to the family, actually. When we first spoke in the first episode, it was all about family. And practically, really, Ed, this could turn into a box set. We'd never stop talking for the next couple of days. But I do want to bring it back to the family. I know your family have grown up a bit now, but you spend a lot of your time talking to people about photojournalism and how it's affected you and how you've worked in it. How does this occupation fit with family life, and what you can share when you return from your travels and what you've seen, and whether it ever stops in your mind what you've seen, whether you can ever slow and just be?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because it's addictive. For me, not for my family, it's addictive. And actually, the metaphor probably works. And for the people around someone who's addicted, it's not always so pleasant. And so thankfully, it's not a destructive addiction like other forms can be. But nonetheless, that is the case. So when the kids were younger, I basically missed half of their lives. And, thankfully, we've come out of it really well. I count myself as super blessed, and I have so much gratitude, not especially for Julie, my mate, who enabled this to happen. But also that my kids get it and they respect me and they're proud of me. But when I was younger, when they were younger, and I was younger too, they didn't get it. And I just think that we just tried to protect them. It's very interesting. When my son turned 21, I get a text from him and he's like, "Dad, I looked at your website. You're really good." And I thought like, fuck this shit. No, I was like, oh my God, it took him 21 years to see this. But anyway, so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but let's just say that this is a really difficult profession to raise a family in. And if you are in it, or you desire to be in this profession, then if you want to have a family, you better choose wisely who your mate is. And they better be someone who can be strong and be independent. And also, and I give so much gratitude and credit to Julie for this, when I was gone, she didn't badmouth me. That's another, it's like having divorced parents, right? Which I don't know what that's like, but I imagine if when the kids are with one and then that parent badmouths the other parent, it hurts the kids, right? So thankfully Julie did not do that. So my kids were not imbued with a sense of like, dad's a jerk or he's an asshole or whatever, that he's just out there working hard and trying to do some good.
Ed, I was fascinated by The Sandwich Generation, which is a film and study you made with your wife, Julie. First of all, The Sandwich Generation wasn't a phrase that I was particularly familiar with in the UK. I'll let you explain what it is, though.
Yeah, so the Sandwich Generation is a term that probably, I became aware of it probably in the early 1990s, late 1990s, in the US, which basically describes presumably a middle-aged or young couple who have young kids, but also have to take care of elderly parents or an elderly parent. And so it's that idea that you're sandwiched in between these two generations. And quite often the bulk of the caregiving falls on the women, but thankfully that's changing.
When was the film made? I mean, it's a few years ago now, isn't it?
Yeah, so we made two short films on the subject. The first one was in 2006,
and you made it with your wife. Well, I wondered actually whether that film was inspired by other projects that you've worked with when you've photographed the aging process, as it were.
Yeah, so we had just come off in 2003. We published a book and came out with a documentary film about the project Aging in America. We had spent about 8 years developing that, and that really is frankly what pushed us to move from San Francisco to New Jersey to take care of Julie's father, because as I like to say, this was a case where being a journalist made me a better human being. And when we were confronted with our own elder, parent who could not live alone anymore, instead of just putting him in warehousing him in an assisted living facility, we realized we really need to move to him, near him, move him into our home and take care of him. And so, it's really true. They say timing is everything in life. Well, the week we moved him into our new home, I got a commission from MSNBC.com to do a project on the sandwich generation. Right. And it's one of the few times in my career where a commission turned out to be basically a personal project.
Yeah.
And so I turned to Julie, to my wife, who's a collaborator in many of our work. She's a filmmaker. And I said, we don't have the wherewithal to do the research to go out and find a family who's going through this while we are going through it ourselves. So what about we turn our cameras on ourselves? And she looked at me and she basically said, you can do it, Ed, but I'm going to take care of my father.
Although there was a coming together of minds on this in the end, of course, because you collaborated on this together.
Absolutely. Well, that's why she's so amazing. She not only did a tremendous job of caring for her dad, and I absolutely pitched in as well, but she also contributed to the documentation and, of course, edited the final film. So, but it was a really interesting time in that way. As most photojournalists and documentarians, I'm not used to looking at myself or my own home in this case. And I cannot tell you how the riches and the discoveries I made that have made me not only a better person, but I believe a better photographer, a better documentarian, because now I know what it feels like to be photographed and to be filmed, even in moments that are compromised, as is so often in the case when we document other people's lives, we capture them in compromised or vulnerable moments. And as a teacher and a mentor now to many younger photographers, it's something that I emphasize how important it is to develop that sensitivity, because often, or let's say sometimes, the media, however sensitive the person may be, we can be a bit callous, because we have a job to do. But the job isn't, making a widget. It's inveigling our ways into people's private lives and capturing these vulnerable moments.
Well, of course, in this project, you were turning the camera very much on yourself, on your family, on each other. How long did it take you to get used to that?
Well, so a really interesting thing, that came out of this was very quickly what I realized was, for me, like emotionally and psychologically, being able to pick up a camera allowed me a kind of distance from what was going on in my home. And so in some ways, I believe it buffered maybe the stress or the emotional impact I might have had if I was just there, as I say, as a civilian or as a family member. Now, there were times where I would drop the camera and take care of Herbie. I like to say that also this was a time where there was also very humbling, where when you are changing the diaper of your, father-in-law, it doesn't matter that he's an in-law, of a family member, and you're learning what it means to make sure someone's clean and really, really cared for the way you would want to be cared for yourself, and it really drove home just how deep all this is. And also, there are millions and millions of people, not just in the United States, in most of the industrialized world, and increasingly throughout the whole world as we age, that are going to be confronted with these situations. Now, I'm well aware that outside of, let's say, Western culture, what we did is not extraordinary. That's just what you're expected to do, you know? So I'm well aware of that. I you know, maybe in the context of being in America, it seemed a bit, not extraordinary, but, you know, something special. But even in the context of America, there are many American families that are beautiful with their loved ones and take care of them. But there's no question that this sort of, you know, capitalistic Western society is, for whatever reason, is sort of now oriented in such a way that we marginalize our very young and we marginalize our very old.
You said that the looking through the eyepiece into this story gave you some distance perhaps at times, but was there catharsis as well? Was it a process where it helped you accept this whole thing more easily?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. Well, you know, one thing that happened for me also, not only in caring for and documenting Herbie's life with us, but previously when we were working on the aging project, was that often when there was a tough moment, I was the one in the room crying the most. And I kept on wondering, like, you know, I'm a bit of a softie, but, you know, why is that? And then I realized, like, my father died when I was 10, and that was in like 1967. So it was a time where, you know, kids of that age were shielded from, he had died of cancer. So I never got to say goodbye to my father. You know, and it wasn't anything I thought about until I started to, you know, learn these things through my work and observe other people going through that. And so I do believe that doing this work really brought out for me, when you talk about catharsis, it made me understand better why I get so emotional in situations, often with complete strangers, right, barring the situation, except for the situation with Herbie. And yet I'm like the most emotional person in the room. And sometimes, like, I think the family members look at me and go, what's wrong with this guy? You know, but I also believe that when you can show that level of empathy and do it sincerely, not acting, obviously, that it also opens people's hearts, you know, and it makes them feel more comfortable and accepting that you're there. Because let's face it, it's really weird to be with a camera in someone's home as a loved one is dying. Yeah. You know, it's weird what we do, you know?
On that note, was Herbie, I mean, at times he would have been aware of you with a camera, and Julie with a camera, because she made pictures and was making the film. Yeah. Other times, of course, he's not aware of it and really doing what just Herbie does.
Yeah.
So those times where he could engage with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was always, you know, it's always a tricky one. It's sort of like, does he realize what's going on? Yeah. Or he totally realizes what's going on and he just can't figure out how to tell you to, like, F off. You know what I mean? I know there was one time where we showed him a rough cut. I don't know what we were thinking, you know, and then we realized, like, for days afterwards, he was depressed. And we were just kicking ourselves, like, you know, man, what were we thinking? You know, it's, you know, these are very challenging kinds of projects to work on. They're very challenging, but they're absolutely necessary, because one thing that I've seen, and I mean, just the fact you want to talk to me 14 years later about this, is that it's a universal issue. It's a universal condition that so many people, regardless of race, religion, nationality, all those things, we will maybe hopefully go through it, right? That we get to have an elder who lives a long life and that we can care for them at the end instead of some other sort of tragic ending, you know? So there's no question that this project, this story, this kind of story taps into a kind of universal vein of experience and empathy.
The whole family was involved in this. I know your children have grown up a bit more now, but they were involved in it. What did they feel about the process of it?
Well, yeah, you know, so at the beginning, I just said to everybody, and we actually at that point had an au pair from South Africa, Debbie Robertson, and she was amazing, and so I basically, you know, we have a 3-story house, but Herbie couldn't go past the first or second floor. But I basically sprinkled video and still cameras everywhere because I was, you know, I'm also travel a lot. And I was like, I just said to my kids, who were at that point 11 and 8, to Debbie, and of course to Julie, if you see something, grab a camera and record it, you know? And so it was interesting because there were times where the kids were into it. And then there were times in retrospect where I think, maybe they were seeing a little more than they could handle or they could comprehend.
But do you think they did, or have you had conversations with it now where, because of course, unlike most families, they have a rather well-known father in the photographic industry that brought this story to life, and it lives on. Here we are, as you say, talking about it 14 years later. Yeah,
I think overall they appreciated, and in retrospect, they definitely appreciated. But in the moment, it was probably, also like pretty standard operating procedure with me, where I was always pushing them a little bit in general in life, because, there's something that's very hard when you have a job or the work you do, gets you into the world in a very intense way, where you see things, and doctors, nurses, my God, so many other professions would be in the similar state. And then you go home and it's sort of like, you can't forget about all you've seen, all you've experienced, all you've felt. But you do need to be careful not to unload that prematurely on your kids, especially when they're at those young, tender ages. So, I think I'm happy to say we made it and we're doing great. So we navigated that sort of tricky period. And I know without doubt that they have been imbued with this sort of gift of seeing these things and having some understanding of what it means to come through for someone else.
That's interesting, actually, because with everything you've seen in your career, everywhere you've traveled, everything you've shot, the stories that you've told, here you are making the most personal story. I wonder if you were aware that you were photographing it any differently. I know there was a difference because it's a personal story, but did the Ed Kashi professional photographer head go on?
Oh, totally. As soon as I would pick up a recording device, then I was in that mode, and again, as I'm sure you have heard or you've experienced it yourself, it does create a kind of safety. However unreal it may actually be, and I think the classic is in war or conflict work, where, when you have the camera, you feel you're somehow protected, which is, of course, a bunch of BS. But nonetheless, so in a much less hyped up situation where, even though we're dealing with emotional and difficult situation, it's still relatively calm and there's no conflict. It's still quite challenging. And having that camera in my hand gives me that space, that distance. It's interesting. I've really come to see, I believe this with all my fiber, especially now that I'm meeting younger photographers through teaching and mentoring a bit, is that people who are drawn to this profession carry some amount of trauma and or they're, immigrants, refugees, misfits, displaced people in some way, so I'm a first generation American. My parents are from Baghdad, actually, born and raised, and came here in 1942 to New York. So I was born in New York City anyway, but I've come to see that gives us this ability to be the observer. So it's like a natural place for us to be an observer, to stand on the periphery and look at things.
There was a particularly moving moment when Herbie moves out of the home he's lived in for 40 years. He was a real collector, wasn't he, when you look around that house?
Yeah.
One scene sees him holding on to his golf clubs while everything is being moved out around him. You're even hearing things falling over and smashing. And I suppose every moment with his deterioration must have seemed in some respect like a milestone moment, a signed juncture. But I suppose moments like this more so, weren't they, really? They were.
Yes, and Neil, we made probably the biggest mistake, because we didn't know what we were doing. We made the biggest mistake that day by bringing him to see that. It's one of those like, what the hell were you thinking, man? Because there was no need for him to see that. But what we did, unfortunately, is we forced him to watch his life be taken away. And so no wonder that later that night, when we were back at our home, he got up in the middle of the night and he fell.
Yeah.
And then he went to the hospital. Thankfully, he survived that. But, there's no question that he must have been so agitated. So again, you live and you learn, and we still kick ourselves like what were we thinking, you know? And this is, and you know, this is important. This is an important sensitivity as a documentarian to hold and to understand. Again, even if you're, you know, when you're not documenting your own family's life, is that we put our work ahead of him that day. Right. So the filmmakers in us were like, oh, this will be a great scene, right? We'll get him, you know, in the situ as the movers are dismantling his home, not thinking about the impact it would have on him. And it's interesting how it's impacted me and how I work now. And I'm much more sensitized to the impact my work will have on the people who I photograph.
Isn't that interesting? And at the medical center that you mentioned after his fall, there's a still photograph of you sat against the wall. Herbie's in the foreground, you're in the background, you're in focus. Your eyes are to the ceiling. I think there's a crying shot as well, as you mentioned already, that you were very emotional through it. I mean, that's a still image that says everything about the rising stress that the children actually talked about in the documentary as well. But this still image holds all that for me. That is, I suppose, of the film that is the moment for me. It seemed that you both were beginning to document this is you and your wife were beginning to document each other as much as Herb at times. Was that the intention, or was that just the way that it progressed?
Well, you know what, I think it had to do with sort of, you know, how to create a narrative, you know, figuring out what's the narrative going to be, which is also why we did, you know, A-roll interviews of each of ourselves, both Julie and myself, because whether we wanted to or not, or unwittingly, we were prime subjects of this story. And so you did need to hear our voice. And, you know, one thing I'm very proud of, and I think that's also important and why it has touched so many people around the world, is that we were so candid. We didn't candy coat it. We didn't, you know, we reflected on the difficulties and the challenges and you know, the not defeats, but, you know, the things we did wrong and but at the same time celebrating him and how beautiful it was and how fortunate we were to be able to experience that.
We're talking primarily about the first film, but of course there was a second film, and the first film is the story progressing with Herb. And in the second film, of course, well, during that time, Herb passes.
Yes. So what happened was we did the first film for MSNBC.com. And then we were asked by AARP, it's like the American Association of Retired Persons. I think it's like the largest magazine in America because of it goes to everybody who's over 55. Right. But anyway, and so they asked us, this was also the early days of what was called multimedia. Yeah. Then they asked us to do a follow-up film a year later, which was called Living with Herbie. Anyway, and so in the process of doing that, he passed during the making of the second film. And I remember the night he died, Julie, myself, and a caregiver who his nighttime caregiver were around him. And I pulled out my little, you know, Canon SureShot or whatever, a little camera. And I took a picture of him, you know, kind of like slack jawed, you know, he was dead, right? Because that's what I do, right? I document. And then it was a few years later, I was going through my archive for something else. And I came upon that photo and I was floored. And I thought, man, when did you ever think you would ever share or use this photo? Yeah. You know, like, again, it gets back to that thing of maintaining the dignity and respect of your subjects, you know, that it might be a dramatic shot, but also, why would anybody want to look at something like that? So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's interesting, you know, these things that we go through in doing this work, there's so much, if you are open to it, to realize and to understand about yourself, about the world, about the people whose lives you document. But, this story ended with his passing, but it was a beautiful passing in that he was at home with us around him. It was also fascinating because our daughter came in, so she was like 8 or 9. She came into the room and then ran out and started crying. And our son, who was 3 years older, refused to go into the room, but he lay down in the fetal position on a couch in the adjacent room. It was very interesting to watch how both of them processed this.
Talking of the children and lightening it just a little at the end of this, because there's light and shade in every story. It's a fascinating documentary, it really is, and you're completely right. We're an aging demographic. 20 million families in the documentary you said find themselves in the situation, the sandwich generation in America. But toward the end of the film, the children comment about one day both of you moving in with them, I think. There was a particularly funny moment where they said that they'll, obviously technology moves on, they'll just move you through to the room when they need you on a mechanized bed.
Right. Well, that was our daughter, Isabel, because she was like, I'll want to live with you when you get older, but I'll have a bed where I can press a button and then it'll move the bed into my room. And of course, my thought was like, damn, you're lazy. Yeah.
And my thanks this week to both Ed Kashi and Joel Meyerowitz, two real powerhouse voices of photography in one episode. And, that's it for today. If you can't wait until next Friday and want to walk a little further together, then that's what the Extra Mile edition is all about. We're up to number 134. I try to think of things to rhyme with these. 134, 134. You go the extra mile for me, so I go the extra mile for you. There's got to be a rhyme with door, something like that. This week, part 2 of my conversation with the photographer Matt Jacob, the pilot, the photographer, the educator. And I'm also talking with Giles Penfound, the co-host, if you will, of the start of the Encounters workshop I mentioned earlier. We'll be talking about storytelling.
On this week's Extra Mile.
What's the most important thing about storytelling?
Understanding what the story is. It seems obvious, but that's the most important thing. Is what is the story that that is out there to get? Okay, that you want to get, that I want to get, that I want to make, that I want to make up, that exists, and kind of all the permutations of that. But recognizing also from what purpose and context that you're approaching that story.
To put it simply, I love photography because it makes me feel alive, and it makes me feel like I have done something, and I've produced something, and I've created something that's mine. But much wider than that and much bigger than that is to inspire curiosity and thought in other people.
If you go to the website, follow the link that says Extra Mile or the orange support button, you can join our community, listen to the Extra Mile shows and be a part of our Zooms and support the show. So it can go into the future, cue the film. Our PS to the show is to come, but before that, we need a play-out song, as always. And, it's from Low Light today. If ever there was a band that had a name made for a photography podcast, it would be that. This is a song called Surrender.
I stepped out from the dark today into the world. I felt the light on my face. I kept trying to be the brave when all I needed was time to be afraid. You were firing shots in the dark, aimless and bewildered by the loss. You felt the blood run from your heart, though the beating never stopped. Oh, the beating never stopped. Even when chances are found, don't surrender. You can lay your claims within. Please remember that you and you alone burn just like embers. Don't surrender. I drew breath from a newfound fight. It gave me the strength I needed to come back to life. For every love that has expired, there's a universe waiting to collide. And even when chances are fair, don't surrender. You can lay your claims within. Please remember that you and you alone, you burn like embers, and don't surrender. And I knew it all along. What's worth having takes this long. No one got it on their own just yet. And even when chances are fair, don't surrender. You can lay your claims within. Please remember that you and you alone burn like embers, and don't surrender.
Fabulous song, Surrender from Low Light. Just a few closing thoughts before the PS. My sincere thanks to you. If you are or you're about to become an extra miler, we'll keep building this wonderful community of kindness in the photographic and walking world together, a safe place to share our thoughts about this thing that we do, photographing and walking. Next week, it's the India special. All these specials. We've had a couple of months of specials as we've been on our travels and things like that, but this one's a very special. It's where we went to India, 9 photographers plus myself, Jason Florio and Shivam Pandya, our Indian guide as well. A few mentions for those who smooth the voyage for me. My thanks to Neil Ford, who looks after IT. When your tech says no, our head of IT says, let's fix it. He's like Bob the Builder with a ping plotter instead of a hammer. Is that the right tool? Although I'm sure he's been close to using 1 or 2 hammers in his career as well. He can help you too, you know, if you drop me a message. I'll link you two together. My thanks also to Andrea Gilpin, who keeps a watchful eye over Instagram, as does Kelly Mitchell for Facebook, and to Michael Mixon, who helps with show research. Write a postscript for the show. And really, I should be referring back to both Joel and Ed today, shouldn't I? Which is precisely what I'm going to do. So instead of little old me reading a postscript, I'm going to play you back some of their thoughts from the show today. We are back next week with the India special.
These things that we go through in doing this work, there's so much, if you are open to it, to realize and to understand about yourself, about the world, about the people whose lives you document.
You know, all of us want to be successful at what we do, and success is too often measured by financial success. But the success within yourself of doing something that gives you pleasure and educates you, to me, that is the goal.
I also believe that when you can show that level of empathy and do it sincerely, not acting obviously, that it also opens people's hearts, you know, and it makes them feel more comfortable and accepting that you're there.
Everybody is capable of discovering aspects of their sensibility. Let's call it their sensibility, because that's all photography is. It's a sensibility that you feel about where you are or things you see, and you react within your sensibility by saying, ooh, and you raise the camera and you make a photograph of the thing that called out to your sensibility.
What's there to hold?
in the light of this moon. My mind keeps searching, but my heart decides thoughts can be cruel. They're not mine to hold. The space unravels when you let go.
The Photowalk is a Loading Zone production.